I'm Sarah Konoski, and I've got a special episode of Conversations to share. Kathleen Folbig telling her own story. For 2 decades, Kathleen was locked up in prison, wrongly convicted of the deaths of her 4 children, until friendship and science set her free.
I'm in prison accused of murdering my children. I didn't physically do it, but carried something that did.
Hear my interview with Kathleen Folbig right now on the ABC Listen app.
ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Arrested at a Japanese airport with 2 kilos of meth and put on trial. How Donna Nelson's trip to meet a man she was planning to marry turned into a nightmare. I'm Stephen Stockwell. Welcome to the case of the romance scam.
Since her arrest in early January 2023, Donna Nelson and her family have been living a nightmare.
2 kilograms of methamphetamine were found in the lining of a suitcase that she took to Japan.
Her family has always maintained she was conned into travelling into Asia by a man met online 2 years prior.
The innocent victim of a love scammer.
It just seems like a bad dream. I've never thought that she would have ever been involved in this.
In just a week, Donna Nelson will be learning if she will be allowed to return home to Australia. In our last episode, we met Donna. We heard about the man she was going to meet, Kelly, and about the suitcase one of his associates dropped off at her hotel before she flew into Japan. We then heard how at a Tokyo airport, they found 2 kilos of methamphetamine hidden in the lining of that suitcase. While prosecutors say she was smuggling drugs, her family says she was the victim of an ornate romance scam. In this episode, we're going to take you inside the Japanese justice system and hear about the romance scam story that was presented to court. Helping us tell this story is Olivia Rousset from Australian Story, who spent time with Donna's family and followed them during this trial, as well as the ABC's North Asia correspondent James Oaten, who has been following this story in Tokyo since it broke in 2023. James, in our last episode, you spoke about how strict the Japanese legal system is and also how reserved and prohibitive the culture in Japan can be. I mean, how did you end up getting wind of this story in the first place?
Well, this actually occurred in Australian media, I believe, if I recall correctly. At the time, I was in Australia. So, initially, I guess there was an assumption that, okay, this person's been charged, just quickly get on the phone to the police or the prosecutors in Japan, confirm the charges. Ordinarily in Australia, someone can't be held for that long, unless we're talking perhaps stuff like terrorism, but someone can't be held for that long. So it's a pretty quick procedure. And the police, my experience has been working in Victoria. I imagine it's pretty much the same everywhere, and I've worked in the Northern Territory. But when there is a high-profile case like this, the police will confirm some charges pretty quickly. The day after, you'll get what is called a committal mention, where the accused person will front court, and it can be a pretty short hearing, but basically the charges are openly discussed to the magistrate or judge, and then there is maybe some facts that might be agreed, and they'll talk about, does the person get bail? At least you know the basics of what's occurring. But in Japan, that's not the case at all. So the first mission, I took the responsibility of trying to confirm what was happening on the Japanese end, while our journalists in the Perth newsroom, where Donna Nelson's family is from, they tried to speak with the family.
Yeah. And what could you find out?
Not much. Not much at all. And this is a frustrating point because, like I said, first of all, she wasn't charged straight away, and they did hold her for, I don't know if it's a full 3 weeks off the top of my head, but it was close to those 3 weeks that I mentioned earlier. And you call the police, and they just told us up front, we are not going to talk to you, we're not going to tell you. And we called the prosecutors as well. And at this stage, you don't expect the police to tell you a lot, but you do expect them to say, we have arrested a woman from Australia of this age, and pending inquiries. Something, especially, I guess, after the days, it's quite unfamiliar for us to have someone held for so long for drugs charges without any charges being laid. So that in itself is unusual. But then what was even further unusual is when she finally was charged and how that information was given to the local media who handled the local courtroom. This is a press club. Japan is very much structured in press club format where you have, let's say, a gaggle of journalists who are attached to a specific department, or in this case, a courtroom, and they kind of get spoon-fed this information. Now, they'd given a press release to their press club, so some local Japanese media had published a short article. So typically, as any journalist would, you call up the courtroom or the prosecutors and say, can I also have that press release? I just want to confirm the charges here.
Yeah.
And the answer was no, you're not part of the press club. We're not going to give you that charge sheet. We're not going to give you the press release. And we were quite furious because it's like, this should just be public information. All you're doing is confirming the charges, which you've already confirmed to local media. There's no question about who we are. You know who we are, but because we're not part of your press club, you're not giving it to us. We want you to speak to your manager. And it took about 4 hours later, then they said, okay, we'll give you the press release. And that at least confirmed the charges.
And with us for this episode is Olivia Rousset, a producer from Australian Story who travelled to Japan for the trial, got to know Donna's family very, very well. And Olivia, Donna's family during this time, incredibly worried, right? Like they've got a tracking app on her phone, so they're kind of following her movements. And over this period, it's just been stuck at the airport. They couldn't get information. I mean, how long was it until they heard anything?
I think it was 3 days where her daughters heard nothing. And for a family who spoke several times a day, and they didn't just put a tracking app on a phone for the trip, they had tracking apps on each other all the time. They knew where each other were all the time. They were that classic over-communicators. Nothing happened without everyone knowing. So, the last thing they hear from mum is, I've landed, brr, it's cold, and they all sent silly emojis to each other. And then complete silence, and the girls start talking to each other. I think she landed about 6 a.m. By 2 p.m, they're saying, have you heard anything? And Ash particularly is starting to get very worried. But it takes 3 days before they get a call from the embassy saying she's been arrested. And during this time, they think she's dead. They have no idea. Ash says she knew that it was something to do with Kelly, but there is no way under any circumstance their mother would not contact them for 3 days, let alone 1 day. So their minds are gone to the worst possible place. And I wouldn't say that it's a relief when they find out that she's been arrested, but at least she was alive. But yeah, Crystal, her eldest daughter, has said that those 3 days were the worst days of her life.
What we do know what was happening at that moment is Donna has spoken to the authorities there after they found the drugs in her bag, and she's essentially told them the whole story about who Kelly is, why she's come, where the bag came from, and so on. One of the issues that you hear about this case is how things are translated, and this is always a difficult issue that lawyers warn many people about. When you're just speaking to authorities, you have to be careful, and she wouldn't have been granted a lawyer straight away. That's not how it works here. But in this circumstance, she, from what we heard in the court proceeding, is trying to be honest and open because she feels that she's done nothing wrong, and so she's trying to be helpful with the authorities. But then things are just getting mistranslated. So, for instance, just things like when they're going through messages of her, things, the word horny is turned into anxious, or the size, quote, size of the bag is turned into the contents of the bag, and the quote, particular suitcase becomes the, quote, special suitcase. So what her lawyers did argue is that they're trying to kind of push her into a, neat little guilty case that they can prosecute quickly and effectively and move on.
Right. Okay. So, what happens now? You've confirmed the charges with the Japanese police. You've had your I need to speak to the manager moment, and you kind of have broken through this opaque Japanese system. What happens to Donna at this point? Can you talk to her, or does she just disappear?
She disappears. And that not just for me, for her family as well, and Olivia can talk more about this. But like I mentioned, the Australian system has various procedures that are open, with the odd exception, but it's open, and you have all these committal mentions where they give updates about the case. Now, presuming the person doesn't plead guilty, you hear updates throughout the case. Then there's what's called a committal hearing, which is almost like a mini trial, where they present the facts and evidence to a magistrate, and then they will decide, is there enough information here, is there enough evidence here to then go to trial? And then if the answer is yes, then, months later or years later, you'll have a trial in front of a jury, which we all know about. But the important part is it's all open to the public, to the families, to the media. There is transparency. Here, there's none of that. So when they've decided to charge her, that's it. She disappears from my radar. I can't speak to her. There's no updates about what's happening with the case. And I believe during this whole time, the only person she could speak to was her lawyer.
James is right. It's like, and that's part of, I think, what Human Rights Watch called the hostage justice system. They put in place a communication ban for Donna, and they do this, I think, James, is it across the board for pre-trial, everyone charged? But I'm not sure if it is for particular crimes or not. But she's only allowed to speak to her lawyer. She was allowed to speak to DFAT and to a prison chaplain. She wasn't allowed to speak to anyone in the prison. She was only allowed out of a cell for half an hour a day, and she couldn't talk to anyone. And if she did speak, she was supposed to speak in Japanese, but she doesn't speak Japanese. She had no telephone calls, no television, nothing. And so she's basically in solitary this whole time, and she doesn't know what her family... She can't write letters to her family even, and they can't write letters to her. So DFAT this entire time would go and visit every now and then, or her lawyers would go and visit and just pass on information to the family. So they were just getting these scraps about their mother. And, understandably, that's incredibly traumatic because, she's a single mother of 5 girls, women, and they're stuck there not really knowing how she is or not able to communicate with her properly. So it was the communication ban seems to be extraordinarily cruel part of the system, especially because, as the girl said, we can't compromise the case. We're not involved in any way. She's just our mother. You know, it really is this sort of denial of basic human rights of contact and communication and exposure to other humans.
Yeah, and we've spoken about, how restrictive her conditions in a Japanese prison were at this time between being charged and appearing in court. Olivia, what sort of legal representation did she have access to, during this time to prepare to defend herself from these charges?
Donna was given access to legal aid at first, and according to her daughters, legal aid were just trying to convince her to plead guilty and, take the charges, and weren't really supporting her plea of innocence. And eventually, and they, it's a big thing to try and get money and get a lawyer in another country, and her daughters don't have experience with any of this. So it took them quite a while until they actually hired a lawyer, and they were the lawyers she ended up going to court with. So they initially went to court with this brand new legal team and had to ask for an adjournment so the legal team could get across all the information. They had to translate hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of text messages from English to Japanese. They had to, they had a lot of work to do. So that left Donna for a few more months stuck incommunicado, not able to talk to anyone, not able to write to her family, none of that. So she had to do more time. So it was 22 months in the end before she eventually went to trial from when she was arrested.
James, in Australia, our courts are these, grand buildings in, kind of sort of public squares almost in various parts of the capital cities that they're based in, and even in the regional centres where we have courts. Japan is so much more condensed. Can you describe the building and the court that Donna's case was eventually heard in after those 22 months?
I don't want to have a swipe at Tokyo here, but, buildings here can be pretty unremarkable. They're functional, but unremarkable in appearance. The inside of the courtroom, though, isn't as small as people may imagine. First of all, I guess the biggest difference is that the jury system here is quite different. So in Australia, you'll have a judge and they sit nice and high on this big, imposing mahogany bench. And then you have the jury to the side if it is a trial, and there will be, a dozen or so people sitting onto the side. And you got this big gap space, obviously, to accommodate the jury, then both sides of the legal argument, the prosecutor, the defence, and the judge. This is a little bit smaller and a few rows of chairs, but, there's still some elements that make it look like a traditional courtroom, even though the buildings here are all, only a few decades old and rather unremarkable looking office kind of buildings. The inside does look more like a traditional courthouse. The appeal court, which we'll get onto later, that actually looked very unremarkable. That was a very squished kind of windowless room. But fundamentally, a big fundamental difference between Australia and Japan is that it isn't a normal jury system that we have. It's called a lay judge system, where there are 6 members of the jury or civilians and 3 judges. And that cohort is responsible for determining guilt or not guilty. So they all sit up at the front. So there's a panel of 9 people you're staring at, not just one judge.
I mean, a courtroom is an intimidating enough place with one person sitting at the front of the room. To have a panel of 9 people who, you're talking to, who are going to be making a decision on your future would be incredibly overwhelming, especially being in a foreign system to the one that you're used to. James, can you take us through kind of what was argued here? Donna Nelson is pleading not guilty. She's saying she's been conned, she's been scammed by Kelly and bringing these drugs into the country. When this is being heard in front of that room, in that room, what are the key points from the defence to try and defend her from those charges, and what are the key points from the prosecution to try and show that she had done this?
Well, I guess first of all, going through the trial itself, we've talked a lot about the differences between the Japanese justice system before the trial being very opaque, but the trial itself did feel largely familiar to what I've seen both in my time in Melbourne and the Northern Territory. You have witnesses, you have evidence tendered, you have TV screens showing documents, and everyone gets questioned by lawyers and by prosecutors. So that all felt very familiar to me. And essentially, as we've established, what Donna's lawyers are trying to argue throughout this time is that she was completely and utterly head over heels in love with this person. And the idea that, love is not just blind, but in this case, love was absolutely blinding. That she had no idea that she was caught up in something malicious. And they've used all these text messages, as I've mentioned, 2 years of text messages where they've engaged in what seems online boyfriend-girlfriend type discussions and talking about their future life together. They've brought up the daughter Ashley, as we've mentioned before. But what the prosecution is trying to do is just essentially poke holes, raise enough doubt that she must have known something was suspicious, and it appears to be the benchmark to get her a guilty plea. That's what the prosecutors were pushing. Essentially, you must have known. Your story is so suspicious. This whole scenario around Kelly is so suspicious. You must have known something was wrong. And essentially what the court here, what the prosecutors had to prove, wasn't necessarily that she knew the drugs were there or she was deliberately taking part in this drug trafficking ring, but rather that she was recklessly negligent. That, ultimately, and this goes across the board anywhere in the world, a lot of drug smugglers say they were duped. And the only person who truly knows what Donna was thinking is Donna herself. So what the court here is essentially trying to do is look at the evidence and say, can we prove that, she must have known something, or that what she's saying doesn't make sense. Her argument doesn't stack up. And that's essentially what the prosecution were trying to argue and point out. So if I can just give some examples, the question with, Ashley giving evidence. Now, Ashley, as we've established, was the suspicious one, the one who did have some concerns and doubts, as opposed to the other daughters who were absolutely enthralled that their mum had finally found love. And that's something that obviously the prosecutors grabbed onto. The prosecutors grabbed onto the fact that Donna Nelson had not ticked the arrivals card correctly, that when it says, are you taking anyone else's items? And she ticked no, they've said, you've lied. That is a lie. You know that something weird is going on. You've lied there. And just the idea of taking a bag. They're saying, well, there's 2 kilos of drugs in this bag. How can you honestly say that you didn't notice a 2 kilo shift? Now, of course, her lawyers say, well, this is incredibly well hidden in an unfamiliar bag. But all the prosecution appeared to be doing is trying to poke holes. And again, like I've said before, the only person who truly knows what was going through Donna's mind throughout this entire 2-year online relationship that she had was herself. But what the prosecution here is trying to do is prove not that she necessarily knew the drugs there, but that she was negligent. In other words, ignorance is not an excuse. Whereas her defence are trying to show that she absolutely is a victim in all this and had zero idea, not 1% doubt, not 5, not 50% doubt. She had zero doubt that she was coming here to meet someone she intended to marry, and she'd done her due diligence. She had done her due diligence by opening the bag, by looking at the possessions. There was 2 years of text messages between these two, and not a single phrase or sentence that looked like a code word for drugs, let alone actually discussing drugs. Not a peep. Yeah. And so they've tried to tell the lay judges here and the judges that she had no idea what she was involved in. None. Therefore, she's innocent.
And Olivia, you travelled to Japan with the family for the trial. What were they hoping to achieve by being there, by being in the room during that?
Oh, primarily I think the girls just wanted to breathe the same air that their mother was breathing, like really fundamentally they were so excited about being able to see their mum and have their mum see them. It was heartbreaking. They were terrified of whether or not they'd be able to control their reaction when they walked into the courtroom. They'd decided as a group that they weren't going to cry, that they weren't going to show emotion. They were going to show the judges that they were upstanding daughters who loved their mum, and they were saying everything we do, everything we seem will reflect on our mum. That was really what they were there for, was for them, for themselves and for their mum. And
Olivia, the family is there to be in that same room as her, to see her, to be able to, actually talk to her for the first time in, years at this point, over a year at this point. But I guess along this way, they've been communicating with lawyers and they have been quite involved in kind of strategizing the defence, like trying to help plan that, talk through it, work through it all in the lead up to this trial, right?
Yeah, to a certain extent. Like pretty much Ashley alone was doing the communication with the lawyers and talking to them and suggesting things. The lawyers even came out to Perth and met the family, and they wanted to see where Donna was from. So the family had a lot of confidence in the lawyers as having a good picture of Donna and where she came from. Ashley is just incredibly resourceful. She had talked to other people who had run similar cases or been in similar situations, and she was told about this expert witness, Monica Whitty, who's actually, I think she's the head of software systems and cybersecurity at a university in Australia, especially the human factors in cybersecurity. And she'd been an expert witness for around 10 cases internationally, similar cases. And Ash was putting people like Monica forward, saying, maybe you should get this woman, maybe you should get this person. And the lawyers decided that the route they wanted to take was to humanise Donna, but also to show that how credulous Kelly was. They decided to call Ashley herself as... Apart from, they had the witnesses that were called were 2 customs agents and Ashley, and that was it. And Ashley's testimony, the idea was that they were going to say, here's this daughter who doubts so much she even sends articles about love scams to her mother, yet when she speaks to this man, he even wins her over. That's how compelling his lies are. That's how good he is at making people believe his scams. And, James and I can talk about how spectacularly we think that backfired. But that was their strategy going in. So Ashley was there to tell her story about how she was suspicious all along, but then after speaking to Kelly in that one phone call, how she turned around and said to her mum, "No, I think he genuinely cares about your mum."
I also remember, we heard before that by bringing Ashley to give evidence, that the idea was to show that even Ashley herself could be duped by this man known as Kelly. And so when you see this text message to Donna saying, "Warning, romance scams, please be careful," and she sent it to Kelly, the prosecution have grabbed onto that and say, "See, you did know. This is enough here to show that you knew that these things happened as well." So really what the prosecution are doing is grabbing onto whatever they can just to raise enough doubt and confusion. Now, of course, as Olivia made before in the earlier episode, the difference here is that romance scams are typically about sending money to people, not trafficking drugs, and that's what this article was about. But the prosecution don't really care for that. They're just saying, see, you are vaguely aware. You're lying to your daughter about why you're going overseas. You've got this romance scam article sent to you. You're lying on your customs forms. There's too much here that's not adding up. So therefore, that's their strategy. Create the doubt to get the guilty verdict.
Yeah. James, how long does a trial like this take in Japan? I mean, you'll see long trials in Australia with lots of evidence, really complicated, cases to explore going over the course of weeks. What sort of timeline were we looking at for Donna's trial in Japan?
The court case went for less than 2 weeks, and that wasn't every day. The first week was certainly every day, but the second week wasn't. So if I remember correctly, the summary of all the evidence was basically on a Wednesday. So it started on a Monday, ran the full week, and then by the next Wednesday, we're in there for the final day. And then the verdict and the sentence is done together. Perhaps very Japanese efficient. But in Australia, typically you would get the jury saying guilty or not guilty. And then if it is guilty, they would adjourn again. A few weeks later, the judge then would hand down his or her findings. And between that period, if it is, depending on the crime, you might even hear victim impact statements as well to help feed into the judge's decisions about whether or not to give a heavier or lighter sentence. This is all very quickly done. So less than 2 weeks for the evidence and a summary. And then it was only a couple of weeks later, thereabouts, when we got the verdict and the sentence all wrapped up.
Yeah, and I mean, Olivia, you were there for the trial, you were there with the family during all of this, and you knew the odds going in. I mean, we spoke at the start of this episode, Japan has a 99% conviction rate. The family know this as well. You sit through the trial over the course of these 2 weeks. How were you and how was the family feeling at the end of that? Were you maybe more hopeful than you were expecting?
Yes. Call me human. But, at the beginning, I was clearly told by lawyers and people in the know that she had Buckley's chance of being found innocent, and it was 99% conviction rate. And every time I spoke to the girls, they were like, well, she's going to be that 1%. She's going to, buck the odds. And I was like, oh, no, this is going to be a hard fall. But after sitting in court and watching the judges and seeing the argument unfold, like the defence kind of leaned a lot on proving she didn't knowingly do this. She was innocent. She was caught up in a love scam. And it seemed pretty quickly that the prosecution accepted that she was caught up in a love scam and that she hadn't knowingly done this. So, at times there were judges who looked emotional, wiped their eyes, were clearly moved by parts of Donna's testimony or people talking about Donna's impact in the community and the work she'd done for other people. So I couldn't help but feel like maybe, they know she didn't do it. But what I didn't know was that wasn't the end of the story, whether or not she'd done it.
In our next episode, we're going to go back into that room in Japan to find out how the judges rule in the case of the romance scam, what Donna Nelson's future holds. We'll be back in your feed on Tuesday next week. And as I mentioned at the start of this pod, there's a very big day coming up for Donna Nelson. That'll be in a week. It'll determine whether or not she is able to return to Australia. So, keep listening. We're going to follow this as it unfolds in real time. If you have any questions about this, please get in touch. thecaseof@abc.net.au. We'd love hearing from you. We're planning a special Q&A episode with Olivia and James, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from you and answering your questions. So, please get in touch with us. thecaseof@abc.net.au. Also, make sure you grab yourself the ABC Listen app. It is the best way to listen to The Case Of. But if you are using something else, please just leave us a rating and a review, because it makes it so much easier for other people to find this pod and hear the story of Donna Nelson. The Case of the Romance Scam is produced by ABC Audio Studios and ABC News. It's reported by James Oaten and Olivia Rousset. It's presented by me, Stephen Stockwell. Our executive producer is Claire Rawlinson, and this episode was produced on the land of the Gadigal and Wurundjeri people.
Hi, I'm Sam Hawley, host of ABC News Daily. It's a podcast explaining one big news story affecting your world in just 15 minutes. From ABC investigations to politics, the cost of living, to major global events. Expert guests and journalists join me to explain why the world works the way it does. Follow the ABC News Daily podcast on the ABC Listen app.